Plato's book titled Apology is one of the most well-known books in the history of philosophy, in part because it features as its star character Socrates, who was one of the most well-known philosophers in the history of Western philosophy. The book is about Socrates' trial, and it ends with Socrates being sentenced to death. The book is written by one of Socrates' most famous students, whose name was Plato. And the book was written as a dialogue between characters, and with Socrates, of course, in the starring role. And it's probably fairly close to an accurate depiction of how Socrates' trial actually went. The title, Apology, does not mean saying I'm sorry. It comes from the Greek word apologia, which means to give a defense or to give an account for oneself. And the book is about Socrates' defense of himself at his own trial. Now, what I want to do in this video is just briefly introduce you to the main characters in the dialogue. First, there is Socrates. Socrates was an ancient Greek philosopher. He lived from 469 to 399 BCE. He was a native of Athens, which was a city-state in ancient Greece. A city-state was a large city that was self-governed. It wasn't governed by some higher level. It governed itself as its own state. Socrates was not the first philosopher. In fact, he refers to other philosophers, especially people who are called natural philosophers, in the Apology. But Socrates was so important in the history of Western philosophy that many scholars divide the history of Western philosophy as pre-Socratics, which were philosophers that were prior to Socrates, and then the philosophers, Socrates and the philosophers that followed him. Socrates wrote nothing as far as we know, so everything we know about him comes from writings from his students. And those writings depict very different representations of Socrates, representations that don't all match. But for a variety of reasons, scholars think that Plato's representation is probably fairly accurate. And he was a complicated figure. Eventually, when philosophy in ancient Greece became organized into different philosophical schools and different traditions of philosophy, there were several different traditions and schools of philosophy that were very different from each other, both in their approach to philosophy and in their way of life and in what they believed was true about the world. And a number of those different traditions traced their lineage to Socrates and looked to Socrates as their philosophical sage. I'm going to introduce you to Plato just briefly, who is the author of the dialogue. He's not a main character in it. But Plato lived from around 427 to 347 BCE, also mostly in Athens. He was a student of Socrates. Plato's about 30 years old when Socrates was executed, and he was really deeply impacted by that event. He refers to it in various ways in a number of his writings. Plato founded the first university, essentially, in 387 BCE when Plato was 43 years old, and it operated for around 300 years. And that school was called the Academy, because it was located in a grove which was sacred to the demigod Academus. So that's where we get the word academy. We use the term academy to refer to institutions of higher education, and that's where that comes from. Plato wrote many books that are deep and profound. His ideas have been one of the major sources for Western civilization. Plato was the teacher of Aristotle. Aristotle is one of the sources that we know about Socrates from. Aristotle didn't know Socrates personally, but he was a student of Plato, and so he learned a lot about Socrates from Plato. And Aristotle was himself also a very, very influential philosopher in ancient Greece. Okay, so we have Socrates, we have Plato, who is the author of the book, but not really main character in the book. And then the other main characters are Anytus, Meletus, and Lycon. Anytus had served as a general in the Peloponnesian War. So the Peloponnesian War was a war between two different groups of ancient Greek cities and states. One of those groups was called the Peloponnesian League, and that was led by Sparta, and the other group was called the Delian League, and that was led by Athens. They had this long war. It lasted many, many years. The Peloponnesian League ended up winning. What Sparta did is they installed 30 oligarchs, rich dudes, to rule over Athens and keep the Athenian people subjugated. And they were very cruel. They were brutal. During that time, Anytus was a leader in the underground movements, the underground rebellion against Sparta's leadership through the 30 tyrants. Eventually, Athens ended up casting off the 30 tyrants. They regained their own independence, and Anytus, once they became free again, Anytus became a politician, and he was fairly well liked by the Athenians because he had been an Athenian general, then kind of a leader of the underground resistance, and now he was a favored politician. Then we have Meletus. Meletus was a poet. Most scholars view him basically as a puppet of Anytus, who was much more powerful. And then we have Lycon, who was an orator, and an orator is someone who was very skilled at public speaking, which was important in a time when you didn't have microphones. And we don't know very much about Lycon. So those are the antagonists in this dialogue: Anytus, Meletus, and Lycon.